Hello, I'm Frances Deegan Horowitz, President of the City University Graduate Center. Welcome to Women, a series of programs for and about us. I'm delighted Patricia J. Williams is able to be with us today. Lawyer and scholar, she is professor of law at Columbia University's Law School, columnist for The Nation magazine, winner of a MacArthur Genius Grant, and author of 4 books. She's now melded her legal expertise, her personal experiences, to write a powerful memoir of her remarkable life and family. Open House of Family, Friends, Food, Piano Lessons, and The Search for a Room of My Own. It's just been published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux. Welcome. It's good to have you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You grew up in Boston.
I did. Yes.
And went to the Boston public schools.
I did. And during a time when there was still funding for public schools, or when it was uncontested as a public good. And it was a wonderful education.
And 4 years of Latin?
6 years of Latin. Actually, I went to Boston Latin School, or what was then divided into girls' Latin and boys' Latin. And yes, you began Latin in 7th grade. I continued it through high school, and then I actually took it again in college. So I actually have had more like 7.5 years of Latin.
And you went to Wellesley.
I did, yeah.
That was a good experience.
Mm-hmm. It was a charmed life, shall we say. Yeah, it is a wonderful, and I view those years at Wellesley as a kind of opportunity that's all too rare in life. It was a wonderful space for reflection, and I think that it provided a kind of education that allowed you to discover yourself in a community of like-minded people dedicated to an end that I think is relatively still untouched by the sense of panic that's been brought to much of the educational enterprise today. At very high standards, but again, a sense of knowledge for its own ends and its own sake.
And is it there that you decided you wanted to become a lawyer?
I think that developed over time. I think I was certainly, my father has a law degree. He never practiced law. And I think that I was a product of the civil rights movement. So I actually think I always wanted to be a writer. But during the, sometime during the mid-1960s, really before I went to college, I think the civil rights movement had impressed itself upon me as a, not just as a spiritual movement, not just as a social movement or a political movement, but also as a transformative legal movement. And that's why I ended up going to law school.
And you went to Harvard.
I did go to Harvard. I think that I came of age at a time when the doors were just opening. The doors were opening for women to become lawyers in greater numbers than had ever been in the past. I think, again, the value of Wellesley College for me was that it didn't quite make up my mind to become a lawyer, but it certainly fosters independent-mindedness in women as a product of women's education. And I think that's why I was among the first so-called affirmative action women in law school. Now I think law schools are 50% women, but right. At the time I was there, there were still only 8% of the class was women.
And did you know when you went to law school that you were going to be interested in issues of civil rights, or was it an open field in terms of what kind of law you would go for?
I actually did go because I thought I would be a civil rights lawyer. Now that's actually not what I am, even though I spend most of my time in the journalistic half of my career, writing about human rights and international rights and civil rights and liberties. I actually teach contracts and uniform commercial code. And when I practiced, I did consumer protection and personal property brokers laws and truth in lending and that sort of thing.
And so what's the odyssey from being practicing lawyer to being faculty lawyer in a law school?
I think the odyssey is that I was working for a backup center for Legal Services Corporation. So I was doing some form of public interest. The funding for all forms of public interest, and legal services in particular, started to be cut at the time that I started thinking about leaving. We couldn't represent undocumented persons anymore, and we couldn't do class actions at the center with which I was affiliated. I decided therefore, what I needed to do was write more about the issues that the groups of people I was representing faced, that would have some persuasive power in society. So I moved a little bit from the straightforward representational into the sort of the rhetoric of persuasion that is at the heart of law as well. And I decided to teach. That was a good home for me to be able to write, and I've been writing ever since.
And you were one of the chosen few to receive the MacArthur Fellowship.
Yes.
I mean, they're called the Genius Awards, but they are.
It's
That's a little bit of hyperbole,
yeah.
though I don't doubt that you may very well be a genius.
It makes you feel like a genius, and I think that it lends a kind of legitimacy that really does relate to genius in the sense of spirit, in the sense that it literally translates into a kind of spirit that is empowering, and so empowering it makes you feel like you have wings, and it is quite magical in that sense.
And why were you chosen?
They don't tell you. They don't tell you. I mean, I suppose it's for the sum of one's work, but no, they don't tell you who chooses you, who nominates you, anything about the selection process.
Well, I was once a nominator for.
Oh, you were?
For the process, and you just send names in, and whatever information and rationale you have, and then you never hear back whether you know your nominations have been received, but then you never know what has happened to them unless you read about it in the paper.
Yeah, it's quite mysterious, and it is a little bit like being tapped on the shoulder by some great
And
fate.
What has that allowed you to do?
It has allowed me to take more time to write. It's allowed me to be I think spend a great deal of time with my son during very crucial times in his life. It was fortunate because my son was very sick during part of it, and I think that this was a blessing that I couldn't have done without. I can't imagine having done without. I think also gave me the courage to do things that I never would have done before, and that's partly a kind of reciprocal process from the fact that people look at you differently, so they permit you to do different things. But certainly on the inside, it allowed me to work on things that I probably would have not been enough of a nonconformist to really risk. And so I think I'm working on projects. I'm doing sort of certain kinds of archival work with letters in and without my family, looking at various court records that I hope I will produce books with. I'm even thinking of doing fiction, which I would never have dreamed of without the MacArthur. I don't know whether that will go anywhere, but the fact that I even think in that line is certainly a product of a sense of courage it gives one.
And this book, Open House, it has the interesting title of Family, Friends, Food, Piano Lessons, and the Search for a Room of My Own. And indeed, it's all in this book. It came out, you say that you wrote this book as a result, partly, of participating in Anna Deavere Smith's seminar, Civil Discourse and Society.
It's actually called Institute for Arts and Civic Dialogue. Yeah.
And what was that all about?
Anna Deavere Smith is a performance artist who takes on the personae of various political public figures of one sort or another, and she makes them have conversations with one another, even when the personages in question would never be in the same room talking to one another. So she has, during the Crown Heights, I think her most famous piece is Fires in the Mirror. Hasidic housewives would speak through her mouth immediately following Al Sharpton, and so and so by juxtaposing these voices, she's engaged on embarked upon a very interesting project. But I think her project was not to limit it to herself, and to get people to really have the kind of civic dialogue that she represents theatrically. And so she put together a very long-term project, which I believe is still in existence at NYU now. It's housed at NYU, of bringing together politicians, scholars, artists, musicians, dancers, people from all walks of life, firemen, Vietnam vets, and having them talk in the same room, but not just talk, but to speak in different idioms, so that I was called an artist, and I was told to work on a presentation with Oliver Lake, who's a jazz saxophonist. This was not what most lawyers ever get to do in their lifetimes, and it was great, great fun. And we both gained new audiences. We said different things, or maybe we said the same things, but in a different voice. And I think that was very challenging. There's almost a bromide, a cliche of walking in somebody else's moccasins. But what does it really mean to have to so deeply consider what somebody else's point of view that you actually have to speak, not just a cross boundary, but in another professional idiom, or so completely from a different perspective that you become transformed in a way that might be called theatrical, but I think is more related almost to an ethical sense of that I relate to being like a lawyer, of having to become somebody else's mouthpiece, where the identities become melded, or you become infused with the responsibility of somebody else's representation. And I think that is a deep part of the Civic Project that we don't think about often, and that's why I found that institute so valuable. At that time it was housed at Harvard, now it's at NYU.
And this book is partly an outgrowth of that?
Yes, it was an attempt to tell my family history, but also the history of the people with whom I interact in life, with all of the complications of that I think is inherent in any memoir, but any representation that we call nonfiction. How do you tell the truth when somebody else in the room had a very different perspective? So in this, I was trying to tell a story from what I saw, what my sister saw, what my relatives saw a generation ago, what my great-grandmother saw even before I was born, when she was dealing with the same problem. How I am the inheritor of an incredible line of people in my family dedicated to education as perhaps opening the window on how you can read about others and understand others, education being the tool to that greater understanding. So,
well, you open up your life experience in this book, and you talk about your incredible family with all of its different individuals.
It's filled with characters.
It is filled with characters. But a lot of it comes back, I think, to the issues that you talk about in terms of double consciousness, of ways of looking, maybe this out of Anna Devere Smith's, but also your own, what you call rumination.
I mean, the double consciousness is obviously borrowed from W.E. Du Bois's sense of double consciousness that he spoke about in Souls of Black Folk. I have felt it as almost a sense of being yourself in the world, but also having to live almost in a separate balloon of people's stereotyping of you, or people's idealization of you, or people's romanticization of you. And I think that those ways in which you live through the gaze of others was something I was very specifically examining in this book.
And you talk about your Aunt Mary's,
yes.
Her representation of the power of dangerously studied charm.
Yes.
What does that mean?
Well, I think my great aunt was my grandmother's eldest sister, and she was somebody who was actually an actress, and she took the project of assimilation to new heights in that she lived three separate parts of her life. One was as African American, literally indentured servant to the family that had formerly owned that part of my family that had been slaves a generation earlier. The second part of her life as an Indian princess. The third part of her life as as having passed as a white woman and marrying into a very wealthy family. And she studied how to pass herself off in the world, and the extent to which that was a masquerade, a mask, but also a component of a dangerous threshold in any culture between assimilation in its charming, pleasing sense to others, and assimilation in its dangerous sense of burying yourself, of almost burying your ancestry and burying the relatives who loved you and bore you into the world. I think she represented the tension between those two halves of self.
And you point out that this act of passing relates to the concept of host and hostile and hostage.
Yes,
that one is a host, one has conflicting feelings of hostility, and then ultimately one is a hostage to one's own decision.
Yeah. They all come from the same root. See, those 7 years of Latin went for something. But and the complexity of those three notions certainly was what my great aunt was. She was sort of theatrically charming in the sense that she carried a fan, she carried smelling salts, she always wore big hats. She used the word gracious at least 45 times a day. Gracious living, gracious this, gracious that. Goodness gracious. And yet, when it served herself, she cut off the family in that tragic sense that many light-skinned African Americans of a certain generation did in order to get by in the world. It was a complicated social phenomenon, sociopathology of denying who one was in order to advance
And how much
oneself.
of this did you know growing up, or have you come to this only as an adult in terms of reflecting on it?
Oh, no, we knew it. We knew it. Because unlike some people who passed in the African American community, she never cut off all. I think her white husband and his family didn't know about us, but she maintained contact, and then after his death, did rejoin the race as well as the family.
Let's talk a little bit about affirmative action. There are so many people who think, we've achieved access, we've achieved equality, we really don't need affirmative action anymore.
Well, I think many people misunderstand affirmative action, and I think it's been a very unfortunate way in which the word quotas, which harkens for many people back to the quotas, the ceilings on participation leveled against Jews and Asians in this culture, back, and not necessarily entirely back in the 1950s, but certainly as a formal measure, the word quotas was used for immigration quotas and so forth. And that is almost substituted for the notion of affirmative action, which has by and large been a series of goals, a sense of opening doors, a sense of access, as a remedy for a history of specific discrimination. And people have lost all sense of that. And so I do find it very ironic that the entire civil rights movement has been conflated to only a question of affirmative action, where the numbers still, even the doors opened by affirmative action, are still quite small, particularly at the professional levels, at the higher ends of our society, where real policy and real decisions are made. And at the same time, people can be fumingly resentful of affirmative action, even in a city like New York, where 50% of all African American men from 18 to 65 are unemployed. And still one, I think, to hear the discussion of affirmative action, one gets the sense that there's takeover everywhere. And I think that if there's an employment problem that affects white people, it is not that blacks are taking the jobs from them. It's that we have a real problem with employment in this society. But we should not lose sight of the racial disparities of that employment problem. And again, this 50% figure in a city like New York is scandalous, and I don't think we're paying nearly enough attention to the growing divide that is about class, but it is also quite racialized, and we have to take that seriously. And affirmative action has been a small key to that. But the hyperventilation and resisting it, I think, has actually licensed a kind of backlash that is going to be quite dangerous unless we take heed of it.
Well, the multi-generational effects of discrimination don't go away in one generation.
No.
And I read recently a statistic that at the University of Virginia, 50% of all out-of-state applicants who are legacies, that is, their parents went to, are accepted by the University of Virginia. Whereas if you're a non-legacy, it's only about 22%. Now, those legacies are almost uniformly white because until relatively recently, the University of Virginia did not accept blacks. So the kind of multiple advantages that come just from the access that white people had over the generations, my sense is that most people don't understand the weight of that when we talk about issues of affirmative action.
Yes, and or that again that legacy status is a form of affirmative action. That frequently that the children of alumni of various universities are with lower scores than the affirmative action black students get admitted. But there is also, I think, what you're referring to is the component of just what wealth purchases in terms of access to finer education, to tutors, to the music lessons, to the way of life, to the connections, to the networking that is so important in jobs, and that is cumulative. A lot of the disparity between black and white scores, or almost all of the disparity between blacks and white scores, is directly attributable to differences in overall wealth. I think that too many of the studies, and there's been a recent sort of unpacking of that say, oh, well, people who earn the same, there's still a disparity between black and white scores. But no, not if you take into account overall asset wealth, that is to say whether one owns one's house, not just simply whether one has the same salary, but whether or not one's grandparents are contributing to the cost of the private school education, whether one rents and so forth. And that sort of thing makes a huge difference in terms of the ability, the time, whether or not one has to have jobs after school. And and again, those are cumulative. It's nice to believe that we are all self-created and that everything is the product of hard work. And certainly one wants to encourage hard work and initiative and autonomy. But I think it's much too facile to say that it also has nothing to do with what the gifts that are passed on intergenerationally. And perhaps we had to think about how we can spread those gifts more generously.
Well, what do you see going forward in terms of the survival of the concept of affirmative action?
I'm very wary about predicting the future, and particularly at such a precarious moment where people's resentments are very volatile right now. I think that people are not talking about race as much as they did even 5 or 6 years ago. But at the same time, I think that
because people are afraid?
I think the question of terrorism has reworked the resentments, but at the same time, I think that a lot of it is happening very quietly. People feel that the conversation is done, and therefore we don't have to worry about this anymore, and that it's every person for themselves. So I actually think that the discussion of race has become quieter, but the lack of consciousness about race is a very worrisome trend. The sense that that the remedial purpose of the civil rights movement is in the past, I think again disguises growing disparities in wealth, in education, in employment certainly. And I think that as we face growing economic problems, our economy, as it affects everyone, I am very worried about how this will break down as a kind of resentment of black and brown skinned people, of immigrants, and then again as ultimately racially, which has always been our great divisive factor in this country. But I am worried that right now it says, I think there was a little Boondocks cartoon in which the character in that cartoon, runs to his grandfather joyfully and says, Grandpa, we're, black people in the United States are the third most hated group, as though that's cause for celebration. I don't think that's celebration, and I think that the status of black people is intimately linked to the status of whoever the suspect profile du jour is, whether that's Arab Americans, whether that's Chicanos or Latinos, or whether it's anti-Semitism. I think that our our fate as Americans is all very much interlocked, and that the degree of resentment we face, the temperature of that resentment, whether it's directed to anyone, is a dangerous phenomenon. And we need to really take stock of that right now.
And what, in taking stock, what do you think is the most effective, one of the most effective approaches?
I'm a lawyer. I believe in due process. I believe in habeas corpus. Aside from the educational access, I'm extremely worried about the dual system of justice that's grown up in the war on terror. I'm worried that people can disappear, that we are not giving a whole class of non-citizens and some citizens access to lawyers, access to trial, ability to confront and cross-examine the witnesses against them, or to even know the evidence or charges against them. I think that's a very, very unfortunate part of what's developed in the last 4 or 5 years. And I think the surveillance powers, these are all familiar. From the McCarthy era to the COINTEL operations against the Black Power movement. And I think that however afraid we are, we cannot sacrifice the protections that allow us to be full citizens.
Well, we could go on for a long time talking about these issues. You touch on many of them in this very fine book that you've written, but I'm afraid that we're out of time. My thanks to Patricia Williams for joining us. Open House, A Family, Friends, Food, Piano Lessons, and The Search for a Room of My Own has just been published by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. For the City University Graduate Center and Women to Women, I'm Frances Deegan Horowitz.